So today I just wanted to take a quick look at Beetlejuice. This is the 1988, I guess you could say, horror comedy film. Obviously most of us are very familiar with this movie, which was directed by Tim Burton. So of course you've got the story of the two lovebirds, the Maitlands, who meet an untimely death. They pretty much just fall off of a covered bridge. I guess they land into, don't remember if it was a river or a lake, but they pretty much meet their end. And what I always thought curious about that scene is because it wasn't really too high a drop. Of course, we don't know how deep the body of water was, but it just gives me the impression, just because they didn't have so high a drop, that potentially they could have gotten out. But then, of course, I know once you open doors, it weighs everything down. So yes, I do know that that does change and affect everything. But definitely a very good film in my opinion. It's one that I watched a lot in my younger days. So of course I'm not going to take you through the synopsis because I'm assuming most of us have seen the movie already. But one of the things that I kind of thought a little bit laughable was the fact that Warner Brothers disliked the name of the movie Beetlejuice, so they kind of wanted to change the title to House Ghost. Tim Burton responded to this by suggesting that they change the title of the film to Scared Sheetless. Obviously this was just sarcasm, but much to his dismay they actually took him seriously, which, you know, I guess that's kind of funny. Of course it really would have sucked if that potentially had become the title of the film, but it would have changed the tone altogether. So you never know, we could have wound up with something entirely different. But the film itself, if I'm remembering correctly, went through two different rewrites. The original film itself was extremely grim, in which Beetlejuice was actually more of a winged demon. So he wasn't, you know, this comical pervert that just kind of went around just doing random stuff. He was actually just very sinister. Apparently this alternate version of Beetlejuice was able to take on the guise or an alternate form of a Middle Eastern male, which that's a different choice. I don't know where on earth that came from, but it just kind of leaves me like, huh? So this version of the creature, rather than being summoned by having his name repeated thrice, you basically he just has to be exhumed, and he's pretty much just free to go about as he pleases. So obviously this alternate version of Beetlejuice is just nuts. Aside from being a shapeshifter, he, according to the one of the previous rights on the screenplay, he at one point can turn himself into a squirrel, and when in this form he actually chooses to maul Lydia's younger sister Kathy, which of course that character did not make it into the film, but in the screenplay she was the one who was actually able to see Beetlejuice, and she played a much larger role than Lydia, which I'm assuming is probably the reason why Beetlejuice attacked her to begin with. Also, in this version of the screenplay, rather than wanting to scare the Dietzes away, he's actually more interested in killing them and raping Lydia. So yes, like I've said, he's definitely a more darker or more sinister creature in this version of what would have been the film at one point in time. So obviously the original, I guess you could say, right of Beetlejuice was meant to be a lot more sinister. It was meant to be just a horror film, and then of course I believe it was during the second rewrite that the character was later developed into more of a mischievous person, I guess more of a trickster and a pervert, rather than an actual demonic entity. And of course at one point in time they had also considered the possibility of a sequel, which I believe it was called Beetlejuice Goes Hawaiian. I did take a look at the synopsis of that, and it's extremely laughable, and anybody who has ever run across that, you would be extremely grateful that that film never came to pass. It sounds terrible. Of course, I haven't really heard any updates as far as the recent attempted reincarnation at a Beetlejuice sequel, so who knows. I guess we'll just have to wait and see, because this seems to be something that keeps getting placed on the back burner. But honestly, if the sequel never happens, I could care less because I still have the original and I absolutely love that film. So it's been years since I've rewatched this movie, and honestly, I had totally forgotten how young everyone was in the movie. Winona Ryder herself is 17 years old in this film. And of course, Gina Davis and Alec Baldwin look extremely young as well. And honestly, Alec Baldwin, even as an older gentleman, is not a bad-looking guy, but I forgot how handsome he was as a younger man. And of course, one of the major things that I appreciate about the Beetlejuice film is obviously it's a comedy. Some of the stuff is on the hokey side, of course. If you're familiar with Tim Burton's work, he kind of does like giving things sort of that B-movie effect. It's, for some reason, it's just his thing. But I like how even the humorous moments, they definitely play it straight, so you can still take it seriously, but you still get the subtlety of the scene, which I thought was actually really awesome. So this also does happen to be, I guess you could say, one of the favorite performances that Michael Keaton has done as far as his catalog of work. He does state that this film is one of his favorites. Unfortunately, Alec Baldwin does not feel the same way, but I think Michael Keaton, even though he did have limited screen time, I think basically he was only in total, he only was on screen for about 20 minutes, which I honestly hadn't realized because to me, there's so much going on in the film, and then Beetlejuice is just a total scene stealer. It's like when he's around, he totally has your attention. So I honestly hadn't realized that this character really isn't around as much, but you know, still a very awesome character. And of course, Michael Keaton himself improvised a lot of his lines in the film. There's that one scene where Beetlejuice first meets Adam and Barbara in the cemetery, and he kind of starts rattling off about his qualifications about going to Harvard Business School and all of this other nonsense. I'm sure I misquoted that. But if you pay attention, he actually breaks character and he falls into his real voice rather than Beetlejuice's voice. So as he's rattling this stuff off, he's actually telling you stuff that he actually has done in his real life. So interestingly enough, the role of Lydia, they had also considered Alyssa Milano for that part, and I don't know, I think that would have been really strange because at that time period I think a lot of people still saw Alyssa Milano as Samantha from Who's the Boss, you know, just this little cute girl. Whereas Winona Ryder, she had just kind of come off of a more serious role. I believe she had just finished Lucas before coming on to Beetlejuice, and ultimately it was her performance in Lucas that I guess kind of convinced them to cast her as Lydia. So, you know, obviously her performance work was very convincing. But yeah, there are a lot of subtleties here and there throughout the film. Another thing I hadn't noticed, of course, as I stated in the original screenplay, Beetlejuice was more interested in raping Lydia. In this one, he actually wants to buy the cow first. She winds up wearing a red wedding dress, and apparently this is referencing a bit of a saying which I was never even familiar with, which according to the older rhymes, married in red, better off dead. So she's obviously marrying a dead dude, but previously, before then, she had also expressed interest in no longer wanting to be part of the living world. And it's also in that same scene, it's kind of hinted at the fact that potentially Beetlejuice also committed suicide, and this was potentially due to losing his Lenore. And of course, if you do remember, Juno does reference that she was his assistant, and of course, throughout the film it's established anyone who commits suicide pretty much just becomes a social worker or a public worker. So what had been left out of the film, once again referencing back to the original screenplay, is that Beetlejuice did commit suicide by hanging. Unfortunately, it was not done properly, so his neck did not snap and he pretty much suffocated. I guess one of the things I found slightly more interesting, which I was entirely clueless about because I had only just seen this film as a kid. I think the last time I rewatched this was probably about 3 or 4 years ago, so definitely rewatching this was a total refresher. But one of the things I had never been aware of is the fact that Beetlejuice was actually named for a bright red star in the constellation of Orion. So, you know, I'm not a person that keeps up with that sort of thing, so obviously there's no way I could have known that. But if you're also a fan of H.P. Lovecraft, he also does reference Beetlejuice. In his stories, Beetlejuice happens to be the home of the elder gods. So definitely kind of interesting. We kind of go from the written media as, you know, just referencing to the more archaic gods, the ones that have been forgotten, and then we move into, you know, modern day script, which obviously have been scrapped, but he is a demon, so it's really not too far a stretch comparison-wise in how the name was being used. So obviously this is a film that I watched frequently during my youth, and I'm pretty sure everyone has their favorite scenes. For me, the ones that I recall just right off is the dinner scene where everyone's possessed and they're being made to dance around the table and do all of this other goofy stuff. And, you know, as a kid, that's probably one of the most comical scenes in the entire film, as you're pretty much just giggling throughout the entire scene as everyone's making these facial expressions, unable to control their body movements, and then, you know, at some point just kind of just shaking their backsides as they're grooving to the music there. But definitely one of those scenes that I think for most people it's the go-to reference. And then of course you do have the accidental ghost exorcism, which also is trying to I guess draw out the Maitlands, and it's in the scene that he's actually, it's not really an actual incantation, but there are modified bits from a poem, The Warning, which is written by Thomas Lovell Beddoes. So there are definitely segments within that poem that are intertwined within the scene, which once again I had just never known about. But then again, I've honestly not familiarized myself with his work. So yeah, that's definitely something I'd like to look into further on my own time. But yeah, I mean, those are pretty much for me the two standout scenes. Is of course the accidental exorcism, and then of course the wedding, and then of course who can forget the Beetlejuice snake, which, you know, as a kid, it's like that was probably one of the scarier scenes in the film. But it's actually very cool, the fact that they had actually designed the snake before Michael Keaton had been cast, and then of course once he had been cast, they kind of remolded and put his face on the snake, just so it's understood that he is the snake rather than just some random house entity just running amok. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all I have for you guys today. I'd definitely love to continue the discussion and you know, talk about your favorite scenes with you. But that is pretty much all I have for you guys today, and I will talk to you later.